Hey there, Nick Janatakis here. In this video, let's talk a little bit about Webpack. Specifically, is Webpack worth using? And in my opinion, yes it is. And just to set some expectations straight for this video, it's not going to be like a vlog style or a slide-driven video. And we're also not really going to do a deep dive on Webpack. So if you're expecting an end-to-end tutorial on Webpack, then this is not the video for you. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at two different code bases, one that doesn't use Webpack and one that does. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the pros and cons of, how Webpack improves the developer experience and maybe some cons as well. So with that said, let's get started. And also just a heads up, the code that we are going to be looking at today is available on GitHub. This is the source code to my Build a SASS App with Flask course. Although this is a much slimmed down version of the code base that's in the course, you can see here, I did add Webpack, Bootstrap 4, all this stuff to the code base quite recently. So, all the code is here to take a look at. So if you do want to actually get into the gory details of the nitty gritty of the Webpack config, it's all here to take a look at. So before we get started, I guess I'll do a very TLDR on what Webpack is. And, if you haven't heard the term before, it's basically like an asset bundling tool. And you can see here with this really nice animated diagram, it says it bundles your images, it bundles your styles. So imagine that you had a whole bunch of different JavaScript files, a couple images, maybe some SASS files, which is a preprocessor for CSS. And it's you run it through Webpack and it just converts this stuff out here, what you see on the right. So if you had, 15 different JavaScript files, that'll be converted down into one JavaScript file. Likewise, if you had a couple of SASS files, that'll get converted to CSS and then also sent out to be one SASS file or one CSS file. And then you can also do some pretty cool things too. Like if you have some images that you would like to compress using whatever compression algorithms you like lossless or lossy, you can do things like that. And you can also minify your JavaScript and concatenate files. Yeah. So Webpack is really cool in that regard. But that's some pretty high level stuff. Now let's actually just take a look at some code. So you can see down here with my tmux setup, I have a couple of different windows. And the one over here, what we're looking at here is the code base straight up from GitHub with Webpack. And this other one without Webpack is actually not on GitHub, only because what I want to show you here is the old complete version of my course before I made the update. And the reason why I want to show this code instead of the one that's on GitHub is it's just going to make it a lot easier to, I guess, see the advantages of Webpack because there's a lot more style sheets and JavaScript code in this version of the code base. So let's take a look here. So right away here, keep in mind, this is the old version of the code base before I made that free update. You can see here that I have a number of CSS links here, and there's one for Bootstrap, which at the time was Bootstrap 3. And then we have this main style sheet file. Then we have one for Font Awesome 4, which was using, Font Awesome 4. Now it's using 5. And then we also have this other vendor one here for the Bootstrap date time picker. Now, if you know a little bit about how browsers work and how the HTTP spec works, there's a limitation to how many web requests can be sent from your server or web responses sent from your server and then handled by your browser. So when you open up your browser and you go to, I don't know, whatever website, right? github.com or something like that, then your web browser needs to request a whole bunch of different stuff from various servers to, ultimately render that page. So it's you have the HTML response from GitHub's web servers, but then you also have things like maybe a couple of images, right? Like a logo or fave icon and all sorts of other stuff that your site might have. And then you also have things like style sheets and JavaScript and fonts and, maybe, not in the GitHub case, but maybe in your site or whatever, you have some external things being loaded up. You have Google Analytics or maybe Discuss comments or, there's all sorts of there's an endless amount of things, right? And your browser and web server and the HTTP spec, they can only do so many requests in parallel to a specific domain at a time. So if you go down this route of having 15 different style sheets, because at the end of the day, I'm not using that many style sheets in this application. It's a fairly big application, 4,000 lines plus, it's a real SaaS app. But, in a very, very large application, or even like, if you're a little bit less strict than I am with plugins, like, you can end up having maybe like 8 or 9 different style sheets that you might want to include from different like, plugins. Like this is ultimately a JavaScript plugin, but it needs its own style sheets. And likewise with, the CSS, you might think like, well, in this case, I just have a single main.css file, but this file is actually kind of, well, in this case, in the course, we only have about 400 lines of CSS, but that's because we're taking really heavy advantage of Bootstrap. But I mean, imagine you're working on a project where maybe you're not using Bootstrap. Maybe you're using something like I don't want to say like a utility first framework like Tailwind CSS, because that actually requires writing less CSS. But let's just imagine that you have like thousands of lines of style sheets, and if you put them all into a main.css file, you end up Googling around for like, how do you organize a CSS file? And there are like some standards in place to help you do that. But who the hell wants to deal with like, a 2,500 line CSS file where you need to be searching through it all the time? You're using like comments as like navigation breaks in this CSS. Like it becomes very, very unwieldy. But then it's like, well, what do you do to combat that, right? It's like, well, maybe you break up your CSS into like, 15 different files, and you just drop an individual link for each one. But now it's like, we're just compounding that problem before of being able to do a limited amount of web requests in parallel. Now, the HTTP2 spec does alleviate this problem a little bit, where you can make more requests in parallel. But, every request that you add, it's like adding more latency. It's more work for the user's internet connection, more work for the browser to parse all this stuff. Like, yeah, it's an actual problem. And then, if I go down here at the bottom of the file, we have the same issue here with JavaScript. It's like, well, we have one for Bootstrap. We have another one for Moment.js, which is, a way to format times. There's a JavaScript for the date picker, and there's like a main JavaScript file. Now, this application kind of goes with the philosophy of server-side templates with sprinkles of JavaScript. But in the main course, there's still a pretty decent amount of JavaScript. Like there's some Ajax calls from, doing all sorts of stuff, couple hundred lines easy. And then there's all sorts of like processing payments with Stripe. And right now it's all just sitting in a single JavaScript file. Things are broken out into functions, like comments are being used to break things up. And it's a little bit unwieldy. And it gets to the point where, if you're using JavaScript a little bit more in your app, it becomes very hard to manage that file. And not just hard to manage the file, it becomes like terrifying. Like, do you really want to go in that file? Because it's like you make one syntax error somewhere, before you know it, you break everything everywhere. And yeah, like it's not maintainable, right? It's not maintainable in the long run. Now, I would have loved to use Webpack at the very beginning of this course, like 2 years ago. But the first time I actually recorded this course 5 years ago, was the first iteration. It's been completely re-recorded once since then. But I had some feedback from people, and it was like, well, learning Flask and web development and like Postgres and Celery and Docker and all this stuff in combination with Webpack all at once was it was just information overload. Like there was just too many things going on. It was hard to materialize everything, even with like 10 plus hours of video. So, when I re-recorded the course, I ended up not using Webpack on purpose. And then, I let people know that, a Webpack version of the course will be coming in an update later on. And, now at this point in time, in the year 2020, even I would say like maybe even 2000 or 2018, 2019, in that neighborhood, there's a period of time a little bit before that where, a whole bunch of different build tools were around with JavaScript. There was Webpack and there was Grunt and there was Gulp and, all these other ones. And it was a little bit tricky to figure out like which one should you use. And like Webpack was really like infamous for being super hard to configure. So a lot of people didn't want to use it. And, over time, Webpack has gotten quite a bit better in that regard. Like Webpack 4 is actually pretty good. So it's not that much configuration to get this stuff up and running. But now, so this is just one like con of not using Webpack, right? It's like you have these individual style sheets and JavaScript files floating around. If you decide to split them out, then there's too many web requests. If you don't split them out, then it's like super hard to maintain. So that's like an immediate win of using Webpack. If you literally did nothing other than having Webpack configured to just allow you to write your CSS in multiple files and then just concatenate them into one file, that would be a win in itself. And you can also bundle up, your vendor stuff as well. But Webpack does actually a lot more than that. And what we're looking at now is, if I can learn to type. There we go. Okay, opening up Vim here. So now I'm going to take a look here at the same base that HTML file. Keep in mind this is now the open source version of the code base, which does have less content in it. But you can see that there's all sorts of less things here. So now there's just a single app.css file and a single app.js file, which is being deferred for loading. But the main takeaway here is one CSS file, one JavaScript file. And actually, it's not because this application is so simple it doesn't need more. It's because Webpack is now outputting this file, but it's taking a whole bunch of different source files. And if I bring up my sidebar here, we can take a look here. We're not going to really go too deep diving in the code, but you can see here that I have this assets folder with an app folder, and the app is like, your application. And I have some SASS files here and some JavaScript modules as well. The JavaScript at this point in the code base isn't that crazy, but we'll talk a little bit about that in a bit. But you can see right away here, and maybe I'll just jump back to the old code base just to show you how previously I had this public folder and like this is the style sheets, right? We just had like one main.css file and that was it. But now if you take a look here at this SCSS folder, which is SASS, by the way, that preprocessor for style sheets. And this is, again, like watered down kind of version of the code base. In the real one, there's like, triple the amount of SASS files, but you can see now that things are pretty organized. Like if you just want to like jump into the nav bar, it's like, boom, it's right there. Oh, you want to like mess around with typography? Oh, it's over there. What about some form settings? Ah, it's right there in the forms file. So like from a maintenance point of view, it's like, you can segment your CSS in such a way that it is super easy just to like find things that you want to find. And if I take a look here at the app.style sheet itself, it just uses SASS here to like import all the files. And I kind of don't want to get into the gory details here. Just understand that all these imports here are basically for Bootstrap, Font Awesome 5, and like the custom style sheets. Like in the course, I actually spend 3.5 hours going over all of this Webpack setup in SASS and ES6 JavaScript and multi-stage builds with Docker to make it all work. But understand that like it's super easy just to import this from here. Like you can see here, I'm just importing Bootstrap variables here. And like that's a cool benefit of using SASS and a cool benefit of using Webpack because now you can use SASS. So take a look at this, right? If I go and take a look here at the web, so just to give you a heads up, I do have the web server running here for the open source version of the code base. And if you take a look here, like this is the main like Bootstrap 4 homepage, right? There's also like a contact form here as well. But you can see like the primary color of this website is like a dark red, right? So the logo is actually hard-coded to be red because it's an image. But these Font Awesome icons and the buttons here, these are just using Bootstrap's primary colors. And likewise, if you go to this contact form here, this is just a Bootstrap form. And imagine if you were using not Webpack. So like with the old version of this, so what was really like really disgusting here was I was using Bootstrap 3 back when I created the course originally because Bootstrap 4 just wasn't out. And, back then, and maybe they still have it, but on Bootstrap's website, they had like this really massive form where you can just put in some colors that you want, tweak some checkboxes and drop-down boxes, click OK or whatever, and it would just generate you this file that we're looking at here, like a minified single CSS file. And, in that form is where I define that red color, right? That red color from over here. And yeah, so could you imagine if you wanted to change that red color? It's like you'd have to go into this file, pick out just that HTML hex code, which you can get from like, inspecting the element in the HTML, but it's way more harder than that, right? Because now it's like, well, what about when you go back to here, like, what about the overlay color of this outline button? Or, there's the border colors and there's the hover effects and there's like the visited colors. And, there's all these other different colors that are in here and you're going to have to like pick out all of those. And now it's like, imagine you're just like playing around with trying to customize the theme for your own site. And, maybe you don't get the color that you want right away. So what are you going to do? Are you going to do it again and again and again? Before you know it, it takes like literally like 45 minutes to change the color twice, which is, it's a joke. Like No, that is not good. I mean, you can always reuse their form and build it with different colors and drop that in. And that's what a number of folks have done when they wanted to customize the theme. But when you're using Webpack and SASS, it's like suddenly that becomes so much nicer. So if I just open up like the Bootstrap variables file here for the SASS one, which is this file here, if you've used Bootstrap before, you know that you can define certain things like the primary color, secondary color, like the danger warning info, etc. So if I'm just going to comment that out. If I want to change this is the red color, right? This 941 hex code. If I change this to like radioactive neon green, and I just go back to the browser and I do a reload, we can see right away, it's like, well, now suddenly the website's primary color is that disgusting green. If I go to the contact form, there's the primary button with a nice little hover effect of being a dark green. And it was literally just as simple as editing one SASS variable, and we have a new color. And now it's like, well, maybe that color is terrible. It's too light. So let's do like a darker green, right? So you can actually use SASS functions to darken a color by, I don't know, maybe like 25% or something like that. And I go back to the browser and I reload the page. And now it's like, oh, well, this green's a little bit more tolerable. Now it just looks like something that got ejected from my nostrils, right? It's like, yeah, a green color that's not super pleasant, but better than maybe the other green. But you get the idea, right? It's like you have all these great functionality built into SASS that allows you to like import files, make functions here, very easily customize things. Like in this case, some of the input variables are customized from Bootstrap. It was as simple as that. Like I just didn't want the color to be primary for the input fields. I just wanted them to be gray instead. So now it's like when you hover over this, you can see that the darker border is on the active one. So super easy to make changes like that. So that's really like a huge goal. I mean, not a goal, but a huge benefit of using Webpack just for style sheets alone. But then there's like ES6 JavaScript, right? So if I open up like this Bootstrap JS file, also another thing to go up talk about here about the SASS one, talking about, well, not that file, the app.css file. There we go. One other benefit too of this is like, well, you can see here there's a lot of comments, right? It's like, well, this application doesn't use Jumbotron. It doesn't use breadcrumbs. It doesn't use, tooltips or popovers or carousels. So we can just comment these out and, Bootstrap, or SASS, I guess, it knows not to include those files. So our final style sheet file is going to be way smaller in the end because we can only use the code that we want. Now, I know with the custom Bootstrap builder with that form, you can pick and choose that type of stuff, but it becomes like ridiculously difficult when you actually do want tooltips later on in your application. Whereas with this setup, it's like you just uncomment it, in the JavaScript file and the CSS file, and you implement tooltips with like the one-liner, and you're done. Like it is that easy to get set up. So now let's take a look here at the JavaScript file, which is basically the same deal. It's like, I'm not using toasts or tooltips or modal dialog boxes. I'm taking advantage of the dropdown for the nav bar and some utilities. So yeah, I mean, we get the same benefit here. And also what we're looking at is ES6 JavaScript, like the importing style. Now this code base does not have very much JavaScript in it, so it's hard to really see the advantages of this. But, in the full version of the code, there's like 8 or 9 different JavaScript files, and you can almost treat it like Python where you can just import dependencies and you can export some stuff. And, maybe it is a little bit easier if we can just take a look at like one of them. That would be a lot easier just to conceptualize that. So if I go to the real code base, the new version of it, and we just take a look here, I don't know, I wrote a very like naive version of a pluralizer. And you basically just put in a word like the word item, and you put in a count like 1 or 2 or whatever. And if the count is 1, it'll just report back the term item. But if the count is 2 or greater than 1, it'll report back items because it adds the S. And this is like a pretty cool little example to look at, because now with ES6 JavaScript, it's like you can export functions. You can also use classes. We do a whole bunch of that in the course when we set up some more JavaScript. There's also this like string templating now that's built into ES6 JavaScript. Like instead of having to concatenate strings with like the plus sign and quotes, now you can just wrap them in backticks and then just pop in a variable for whatever variable you want to inject in there. And JavaScript will interpolate that, very similar to how F strings work with Python. So yeah, I mean, between using ES6 JavaScript, being able to break up your JavaScript like this and have proper like imports for functions and classes, it just makes the development experience so much better because, JavaScript, at least for me, I don't know, like I don't like it that much. And, I can tolerate it. At least now with ES6, like the tolerance level is pretty good. Whereas before it was like, I just dreaded like, oh, I have to make another Ajax call. It's like, yeah, it's awful. But now it's like, all right, I can do that. It's not that bad. So, I mean, these are just some of the benefits of using Webpack. I'm sure there's others as well. But, as we took a look at, being able to customize a theme using SASS is super easy. Keeping your assets really minified and bundled up is pretty nice. I mean, we're not going to really go over anything here in terms of like the Webpack config, but I do want to just, end this video showing you that this config file, because it is up here in GitHub, it's not like the monstrous, like crazy infamous config files from 4 years ago with Webpack. It's 77 lines of code. There's comments, like 10% of that is just imports. There's a couple of things here, and we do go over this in very much detail in the full version of the course. If you did want to check that out, it is at buildsasapp@flask.com. I'm not gonna like start throwing sales pitches at you. You can go check it out if you'd like. I feel like this page here, it kind of just goes over everything if you wanted to actually give it a whirl. But with that said, yeah, Webpack is an awesome tool. I highly recommend that you learn it. And what's really interesting too about all this code that we looked at here and what's on GitHub, this is what Flask, but there's nothing like magical at the Flask level that makes this work. Meaning, if you're not using Flask, then you can basically copy paste this config file and use it in a Node project. You can use it in a Phoenix project. You can use it in a Django project. You can use it in a Rails project with a little bit of modifications because Rails like adds a little bit of wrappers around using Webpack, and the same thing with Laravel, I think. I'm not really an expert with Laravel, so I can't give you 100% on that. But all these frameworks, like it's not just like a Flask thing. It's super easy to drop this in and get it going. So on that note, I hope you liked the video. I hope this sheds some light on maybe like why it is worth using Webpack in the next web project that you do. And, if you have any questions in the comments, let me know. If you like the video, please give it a thumbs up. And on that note, I will see you in the next video.